Coming up on To the Contrary.
The woman has to prove herself to show that she can do the same work as a man.
Women world leaders. We've interviewed some of the most powerful women.
People sit up straight and listen when you've got something to say, and I certainly haven't felt disadvantaged by gender in those settings.
If I was a man, who's going to say I'm a 77-year-old grandfather? I mean, it's a gender bias. It's nonsense.
We had a strategy, and the strategy was tied to women.
In the future, there will be many more countries that give women the chance and empower women in a different way than today.
We hear from women prime ministers and presidents next on To the Contrary. Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to this special edition of To the Contrary. For more than 20 years, To the Contrary has highlighted the views and perspectives of high-profile and powerful women leaders. We haven't had a female U.S. president to interview yet, but I have sat down with women presidents and prime ministers from across the globe. This week, some To the Contrary classics, interviews with women who've attained the highest office in their countries. After 9 years of self-imposed exile, Benazir Bhutto was back in Pakistan. Corruption charges against her and her government had been dropped, and she was the leading opposition candidate in the upcoming election for prime minister. But on a cold December day in 2007, a bomb exploded as Bhutto was leaving a rally. She was assassinated at the age of 54. I had the honor of interviewing Prime Minister Bhutto in 1995 at the 4th UN Conference on Women in China. At the time, she was the preeminent woman in the male stronghold of international politics.
Are there ways that being a woman in your role as a world leader helps you?
Well, I don't know. This is the first time I've been asked such a question. Usually I find that being a woman places greater difficulties because a woman has to prove herself to show that she can do the same work as a man. So often a woman has to do more to show that she is competent. So I have not noticed any advantages so far in being a woman leader.
Have you ever been discriminated against when you're in a crowd of men leaders, say at the United Nations or some other large gathering?
I haven't been discriminated against at the chief executive level or at the international level when we meet. But within my own parliament, my opposition often subjects me to verbal abuse. And my opposition also subjects me to verbal abuse in the country during campaigns, simply because I'm a woman. So I feel very strongly about the whole question of verbal abuse to denigrate women.
How do you react to it?
Well, I just tell myself that it's they who cannot control their anger and their frustration. They could criticize me for my policy and say her policy on Kashmir is right or wrong, or her policy on population planning is right or wrong. But when they come down to obscene and vulgar language, simply because I'm a woman, I think that shows their frustration. So I try to detach myself from what they're saying and convince myself that it reflects more on them than on me. But it also saddens me that in a democratic society, people should not talk about issues and should start a slanging match.
You are a very strong advocate in the world for women's rights. Your speech here in Beijing, your speech last year in Cairo at the UN Conference on Population, and yet also in that speech you came out opposed to abortion. How do you square the two?
Well, I think that while there are feminist issues on which women agree across the board, there are also certain issues in which there is a divergence of opinion between the West and the East. We believe in family planning very strongly in the East, but we don't believe in abortion as a method of family planning. Of course, abortion is legal if a woman's health is endangered. And a woman can make a choice for herself what she wishes to do according to the religious mores or against it. But within the East, we do think that it is preventive contraception that is important and that we should encourage.
From Pakistan to New Zealand. New Zealand gave women the right to vote in national parliamentary elections in 1893, some 27 years before the U.S. approved the 19th Amendment to our Constitution, which granted women the right to vote on a national basis. Although women had voted in certain states, Wyoming since 1869 and Utah since 1870, New Zealand was the first nation-state in the world to allow women to vote. In 2002, New Zealand's top 3 government officials were women, including Prime Minister Helen Clark. In an exclusive interview, Prime Minister Clark shared her thoughts on why the United States lags behind so many other countries that have elected women leaders.
In our kind of societies, it's a question of getting sufficient critical mass of women in the legislature and the top executive positions for then a move to having a woman leader at the very top to seem to be a very natural and normal thing.
Do you think the fact that New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the right to vote on a national scale, and that you did that decades before we did it here in the U.S., has that had an impact on women's rights?
I wish I could say so, but having been the first country in the world where women gained the right to vote, we were pretty slow following on for a long time. There was no woman member of parliament elected until the 1930s in New Zealand, and when I went into the parliament in 1981, there was a total of 8 women members. That was twice what it had been the time before, out of more than 90 MPs in total. So we've made a lot of progress over the last 21 years, and with the coming of proportional representation, of course, all the political parties have to woo the women's vote. So parties which probably would never have contemplated bringing women up through the ranks in any significant numbers before now have to do so. It's compelling.
You and the other 2 top leaders in New Zealand are women. How does that change the way government does business?
It's changed so much since I first went to Parliament in 1981. And I've often joked about the 3 main forms of recreation which were available to members of Parliament at that time. There was the billiards room, and I never learned how to pick up a billiards cue. That was too boring, too slow for me. There was the bar, which used to exercise the elbow muscle. And then there were the card schools that played late into the night with a lot of money being bet on them. This was no place for a young woman out of the university to be. But I've just seen that male culture largely disappear from our parliament, and it's been replaced by professional, task-oriented people, and women have led the way in that.
So are you saying that men just wanted to drink and play and women just want to get down to business?
Absolutely. The women are very task-focused. We're all busy. We've all got other things going on in our lives, and we come into politics to do a job. We set goals, we go after them, and I think we've been great role models.
How do you relate to other country leaders?
Well, often they don't quite know how to cope at all. I remember when I first went to the Pacific Island Forum, where we sit with a lot of very small states around the South Pacific. A woman leader was a pretty new experience for them. At APEC now, there are 3 women leaders because the Philippines and Indonesia have both changed their presidents outside the electoral cycle in the last couple of years. I go to the Commonwealth Conference, there were 2 women. There was me and there was the president of Pakistan, of Bangladesh present. So you are a lonely group, but I think people sit up straight and listen when you've got something to say, and I certainly haven't felt disadvantaged by gender in those settings.
Now to Liberia's leading lady. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was the first female elected president of an African country. She was elected to run Liberia's government during a time of renewal, change, and violence, work that also won her a Nobel Peace Prize. In 2010, we caught up with her in Washington, D.C. during a tour promoting her initiative to educate Liberian girls.
Why girls? Because girls in Liberia, in Africa, have been the ones that have been left out.
Liberia's history is one of war, dictatorship, and struggle for democracy. It's also one of bias against women. Even with a woman as commander-in-chief, Liberian girls are still left behind, especially when it comes to education. Just 50% of Liberian children go to school. 1/4 of them are girls. Sexual assault in the classroom, teen pregnancy, and high dropout rates all deplete girls' attendance rates.
Over the years, for families to survive, their young children, particularly girls, have been a source of income because they go out on the streets. I mean, there's nothing more heartbreaking than to walk the streets and see a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, with a huge basket or pen on their heads, selling fruits or selling little packages of water and something like that. Kids who should be in school. We've got a young population, some 40% of our population, less than 20 years old. Many of them haven't been conscripted into warfare, have never been to school. And at this stage, how do we respond to that? We're trying to meet the challenges of improving infrastructure. We're trying to meet the challenges of reconciliation coming from wars and the ethnic tensions and rivalries that were associated with that. But most of all, getting our young children back into school and giving them a hope and confidence in the future.
Promoting education reform isn't new to the president. During her campaign, she combined education and women's rights under the theme, "Our time has come."
We had a strategy. And the strategy was tied to women. Many people missed the fact that the ordinary market women, uneducated, caught on to this strategy and caught on to the idea that I sit in the sun, I sit in the rain, and sell my goods for one primary purpose, to educate my children.
After more than 2 decades of civil war, Liberia has a lot going against it. Many places lack electricity or running water. 85% of workers are unemployed. 80% are illiterate. Yet President Johnson Sirleaf says significant progress will be made by January 2008.
Transformation has got to be visible. Transformation has got to be felt by the majority of the people. We've got to touch the lives of these young girls and boys. We've got to make a difference in their families. Because if we don't, the record on that is very clear in post-conflict countries. If you don't make a difference in a relatively short period of time, 1 to 2 years, chances are the country slips back into chaos and back into conflict.
With $37 billion in debt, Liberia will need outside help to make this transformation happen.
Now an American-born woman who led a South American country. Janet Jagan was First Lady and then Prime Minister of Guyana, but in 1997 she became the first female South American president to be democratically elected. She resigned from office because of health issues and died at the age of 69 in 2009. Jagan was born and raised in Chicago and didn't leave this country until she was in her mid-20s. To the contrary, traveled to Guyana to tell you the story of this amazing woman leader.
Guyana, a small South American country possessing one of the largest unspoiled tracts of Amazon jungle and some of the most spectacular wildlife in the world because it is unspoiled by development. Located in between Venezuela and Suriname on South America's Atlantic coast, it's roughly the size of Florida or Great Britain and home to well under 1 million citizens. Controlled variously by Holland and Great Britain in colonial times, its people are a mixture of Caucasian, East Indian, African, Amerindian, and Chinese. Janet Jagan moved here as a nurse with her husband, Chetty Jagan. He was a dentist who became involved in politics and worked to overthrow British colonial rule. Together, they formed the People's Progressive Party in the 1940s, now the country's dominant party and originally Marxist. But the British overthrew his fledgling independence movement and put them both in jail. They finally gained independence in 1966. He later became president. He died in March 1997, and she, who had a long career in politics as a member of parliament and general secretary of her party, ran for and won the seat.
President Jagan, tell our American audience how you came to power. What was your path to power?
Hard work. I've been in the labor movement for many, many years. All during the 40s, my husband and I worked with sugar workers, and I was trying to organize domestic workers in it was called then the British Guyana Labor Union. And so we were mostly involved in the labor movement.
And you were banned for a certain period from returning to the United States? Why
Yes,
was
that came in the same period. After we were removed from office in 1953, they would not allow me into the United States. My father had cancer, and well, he was all right for a while. Then it looked as though he was at the last stages, and I tried very hard to go to the United States, but they wouldn't give me a visa.
You got your start working for women's rights in Guyana, working for domestics, right. First of all, what have you done for women's rights in Guyana?
Issues like water supplies. Every time I open a new water supply for a village or an area, I always tell them this is one of women's rights, because when women have to spend 3 or 4 hours a day fetching water for everything, they don't have time for themselves or their own advancement.
Do you believe that women country leaders such as yourself have an obligation to help raise the status of women in their country?
Well, of course. That's so elementary, you know, that's part of what we're doing.
As a country leader, have you experienced discrimination in a world full of mainly male country leaders?
I remember after the elections, they were leveling me off with other widows who assumed office after their husband's death. But I said, I'm not really in that category, because I've been there from day one, in the streets, in the jail, everywhere. I've been all over the place.
The Washington Post ran a long piece about you by your cousin. She got very annoyed because she saw, when you first became president, she saw a media report that described you as a 77-year-old grandmother. As a former media member, what was your reaction to that?
If I was a man, who's going to say I'm a 77-year-old grandfather? I mean, it's a gender bias. It's nonsense. Why can't they just recognize me for what I am? And you can include the fact that I also am a grandmother, nothing to hide, but they emphasized it, and I didn't like it. I thought it was cheap journalism, just to make me something of oddity, that this transplanted white 77-year-old grandmother is president. And that isn't the story. I'm not president because of that. I'm president because for 50 years I sweated it out. I did the work.
Have you watched, for example, Hillary Clinton and the criticism she took for trying to be in the White House and also work with her husband at the same time?
She's doing what a lot of the first ladies are doing now. It was kind of old-fashioned for Americans to be so far behind that they're going to criticize their first lady for carrying on doing what she wants to do. And she was doing some very good things. Maybe in the Caribbean we're more advanced. The Caribbean and South America, because the women just go and, you know, we carry on our own lives, our own careers, whichever direction it may be, if it's business or teaching profession or journalism, wherever it is.
An interview I found personally very eye-opening. Gro Harlem Brundtland, a physician and mother who served 3 terms as Prime Minister of Norway. She later went on to become Director General of the World Health Organization. I met Prime Minister Brundtland in 1994, where she was a powerful voice for women at the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. In an exclusive interview, she told us how it felt to be the only one in a handful of women at the pinnacle of power and just how she got there.
There can always be partly coincidence, but there is also the fact that my party in Norway, the Labour Party, Social Democratic Party, was actively pursuing during the 70s women's roles, women's full participation in the party and in the country. And as part of that, it was a natural thing to have a vice president in the party, which was me in the middle of the 70s. And then next time around, I became the leader of the party and prime minister. And this was a broad process of moving, seriously women into a full participation at the same level as men.
We Americans think we're very advanced when it comes to women's issues, but I'd like to hear from you how you see our position from an international perspective.
I have lived in the United States for 2 years, once when I was a child, in the 5th grade of primary school, and then as 25-year-old doctor studying at Harvard. And I have seen, the self-consciousness and the self-determination of American women in the educational system. And it's true that your culture brings forward the feeling of worth in women. In that sense, it is true. But on the other hand, the caretaking of values and interest around a woman's working life has not been taken care of in your society. It's so individualistic that to be able to take care of children and be a working mother, you don't really have the social structure that makes this possible. And to take one example, your laws give very few weeks, if at all, for pregnancy leave and for leave after a child is born. This is a great difficulty for any woman in any country. And in my country now, we have been able, by political debate, to have a law that gives the right to 1 year when you have a child, with pay 80% of what is your normal pay. Now this is, of course, this makes it easier to combine the roles of mother, wife, and self-fulfillment for women.
We've debated that issue on To the Contrary, and the conservative response is, yes, you may offer these great benefits, but your economy is stagnant as a result. What's your response to that?
Norway has a growing economy. We have been able to have, low inflation, low interest rates, growth in the economy. We have control over a positive economy. So this is not true.
Another response to that is if you give women a year off with 80% pay, nobody will hire them because they're much more expensive than men as employees.
We have now opened up for men, to a greater extent, taking part of that leave. And so gradually, I think the way we will do it is to share that leave between the parents so that you can in no way avoid the risk of having somebody on leave, even if you hire men.
Do you think it's possible to have a world where all women are empowered?
I think it would both be possible, and I think in the future there will be many more countries that give women the chance and empower women in a different way than today in the world at large. I think this will happen because investment in women, in fact, is today more important than investment in men to take care of our future challenges.
Why is it more important?
This is because of the role that women have in the family, in giving birth to the next generation, in educating the next generation. It means that if women are given education, there will be a natural curbing of population growth. And we need that to avoid undermining the carrying capacity of the earth.
That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at www.pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.